At one time, according to Sir George H. Darwin, the moon was very close to the earth. Then the tides gradually pushed her away, far away. The tides that the moon herself causes in the earth's waters, where the earth slowly loses energy. The rest of you can't remember, but I can. We had her on top of us all the time, that enormous moon. When she was full, nights as bright as day, but with a butter-colored light. It looked as if she was going to crush us. When she was new, she rolled around the sky like a black umbrella blown by the wind. And when she was waxing, she came forward with her horn so low she seemed about to suck into the peak of a promontory and get caught there. But the whole business of the moon's phases worked in a different way then, because the distances from the sun were different, and their orbits, and the angle of something or other, I forget what. As for ellipses, with Earth and Moon stuck together the way they were, why, we had eclipses every minute. Naturally, these two big monsters managed to put each other in the shade constantly, first one, then the other. Orbit, elliptical, of course. For a while it would huddle against us, and then it would take flight for a while. The tides, when the moon swung closer, rose so high nobody could hold them back. There were nights when the moon was full and was very, very low, and the tide was so high that the moon missed a duckling in the sea by a hair's breadth. Well, let's say a few yards anyway. Climb up on the moon? Of course we did. All you had to do was row out to it in a boat, and when you were underneath, prop a ladder against her and scramble up. The spot where the moon was lowest, as she went by, was off the zinc cliffs. We used to go out with those little rowboats they had back in those days, round and flat, made of cork. They held quite a few of us, me, Captain Vidvid, his wife, my deaf cousin, and sometimes little Shelix. She was 12 or so at the time. On those nights the water was very calm, so silvery it looked like mercury, and the fish in it, violet-covered, unable to resist the moon's attraction, rose to the surface, all of them, and so did the octopuses and the saffron medusas. There was always a flight of tiny creatures, little crabs, squid, and even some weeds, light and filmy, and coral plants that broke from the sea and ended up on the moon, hanging down from that lime-white ceiling, or else they stayed in mid-air, a phosphorescent swarm we had to drive off, waving banana leaves at them. This is how we did the job. In the boat we had a ladder. One of us held it, another climbed to the top, and a third at the oars rowed until we were right under the moon. That's why there had to be so many of us. I only mentioned the main ones. The man at the top of the ladder, as the boat approached the moon, would become scared and start shouting, "Stop, stop, I'm going to bang my head." That was the impression you had seeing her on top of you, immense and all rough with sharp spikes and jagged saw-tooth edges. It may be different now, but then the moon, or rather the bottom, the underbelly of the moon, the part that passed closest to the earth and almost scraped it, was covered with a crust of sharp scales. It had become to resemble the belly of a fish, and the smell too, as I recall, if not downright fishy, was faintly similar, like smoked salmon. In reality, from the top of the ladder, standing erect on the last rung, you could just touch the moon if you held your arms up. We had taken the measurements carefully. We didn't yet suspect that she was moving away from us. The only thing you had to be careful about was where you put your hands. I always chose a scale that seemed fast. Then I would cling first with one hand, then with both, and immediately I would feel ladder and boat drifting away from below me, and the motion of the moon would tear me from the earth's attraction. Yes, the moon was so strong that she pulled you up. You realized this the moment you passed from one to the other. You had to swing up abruptly with a kind of somersault, grabbing the scales, throwing your legs over your head until your feet were on the moon's surface. Seen from the earth, you looked as if you were hanging there with your head down. But for you, it was the normal position. And the only odd thing was that when you raised your eyes, you saw the sea above you, glistening with the boat and others upside down, hanging like a bunch of grapes from the vine. My cousin, the deaf one, showed a special talent for making those leaps. He was always the first to jump up from the ladder, suddenly became deaf and sensitive. His clumsy hands, as soon as they touched the lunar surface, found immediately the spot where he could hoist himself up. In fact, just the pressure of his palms seemed enough to make him stick to the satellite's crust. Once I even thought I saw the moon come towards him as he held out his hand. He was just as dexterous in coming back down to Earth, an operation still more difficult. For us, it consisted in jumping as high as we could, our arms upraised, seen from the moon, that is, because seen from the Earth it looked more like a dive, or like swimming downwards, arms at our sides. Like jumping up from the Earth, in other words, only now we were without the ladder, because there was nothing to prop it up against on the moon. But instead of jumping with his arms out, my cousin bent towards the moon's surface, his head down as if for a somersault, and then made a leap, pushing with his hands. From the boat we watched him, erect in the air, as if he were supporting the moon's enormous ball, and were tossing it, striking it with his palms. Then when his legs came within reach, we managed to grab his ankles and pull him down on board. Now you ask me what in the world we went up on the moon for. I'll explain it to you. We went to collect the milk with a big spoon and a bucket. Moon milk was very thick, like a kind of cream cheese. It formed in the crevices between one scale and the next through the fermentation of various bodies and substances of terrestrial origin, which had flown up from the prairies and the forests and the lakes. As the moon sailed over them, it was composed chiefly of vegetal juices, tadpoles, bitumen, lentils, honey, starch, crystals, sturgeon eggs, molds, pollens, gelatinous matter, worms, resins, pepper, mineral salts, combustible residue. You only had to dip a spoon under the scales that covered the moon's scabby terrain, and you brought it out filled with that precious muck. Not in the pure state, obviously, there was a lot of refuge. In the fermentation, which took place as the moon passed over the expanses of hot air above the deserts, not all the bodies melted. Some remained stuck in it. Fingernails and cartilage, bolts, seahorses, nuts, and penduncles, and shards of crockery, and fish hooks, and even a comb. So this paste, after it was collected, had to be refined and filtered. But that wasn't the difficulty. The hard part was transporting it down to the earth. This is how we did it. We hurled each spoonful into the air with both hands, using the spoon as a catapult. Cheese flew, and if we had thrown it hard enough, it stuck it to the ceiling. The surface of the sea. Once there, it floated, and it was easy enough to pull it into the boat. In this operation, too, my deaf cousin displayed a special gift. He had strength and a good aim. With a single sharp throw, he could send the cheese straight into a bucket we held up to him from the boat. As for me, I occasionally misfired. The contents of the spoon would fail to overcome the moon's attraction and then would fall back into my eye. I still haven't told you everything about the things my cousin was good at. The job of extracting lunar milk from the moon's scale was child's play to him. Instead of the spoon, at times he had only to thrust his bare hand under the scales, or even one finger. He didn't proceed in any orderly way, but went to isolated places, jumping from one to the other, as if he were playing tricks on the moon, surprising her, or perhaps tickling her. And whenever he put his hand, the milk spurted out like from a nanny goat's teeth. So the rest of us had only to follow him and collect with our spoons the substance that he was pressing out. First here, then there, but always as if by chance, since the deaf one's movements seemed to have no clear practical sense. There were places, for example, that he touched merely for the fun of touching them, gaps between two scales, naked and tender folds of lunar flesh. At times my cousin pressed not only his fingers, but, in a carefully gauged leap, his big toe.
Oh, hey, that's too much toe. You're showing way too much toe there. I can see it and everything. It's like You're ruining this. I thought it was 100% puppet show, but now it feels like that toe is incriminating. It's like flesh-colored and everything. I know I'm a hypocrite, but at least it's not flesh-colored. Look at that. Now how am I supposed to watch a 100% puppet show when it's only 98 now? Oh, man. I don't know. And he keeps doing it. Come on.
He climbed onto the moon barefoot, and this seemed to be the height of amusement for him. If we could judge by the chirping sounds that came from his throat as he went on leaping. The soil of the moon was not uniformly scaly, but revealed irregular bare patches of pale, slippery clay. These soft areas inspired the devil to turn somersaults, or to fly almost like a bird if he wanted to impress his whole body into the moon's pulp. As he ventured further in this way, we lost sight of him at one point. On the moon there were vast areas we had never had any reason or curiosity to explore, and that was where my cousin vanished. I had suspected that all these somersaults and nudges he indulged in before our eyes were only a preparation, a prelude to something secret meant to take place in the hidden zones. We fell into a special mood on those nights off the zinc cliffs, gay but with a touch of suspense, as if inside our skulls, instead of the brain, we felt a fish floating, attracted by the moon. So we navigated, playing and singing. The captain's wife played the harp. She had very long arms, silvery as eels, on those nights, and armpits as dark and mysterious as sea urchins. And the sound of the harp was sweet and piercing. So sweet and piercing it was almost unbearable, and we were forced to let out long cries, not so much to accompany the music as to protect our hearing from it. Transparent medusas rose up to the sea's surface, throbbed there for a moment, and flew off, swaying towards the moon. Little Silex amused herself by catching them in midair, though it wasn't easy. Once she stretched her little arms out to catch one, she jumped up slightly and was also set free. Thin as she was an ounce or two short of the weight necessary for the Earth's gravity to overcome the moon's attraction and bring her back. So she flew up among the medusas, suspended over the sea. She took fright, cried, then laughed, and started playing catching shellfish and minnows as they flew, sticking some into her mouth and chewing them. We rowed hard to keep up with the child. The moon ran off in her ellipse, dragging that swarm of maritime fauna through the sky, and a train of long, entwined sea lilies, and Xylex hanging there in the midst. Her two wispy braids seemed to be flying on their own, outstretched towards the moon. But all the while she kept wiggling and kicking at the air as if she wanted to fight that influence. The idea of eating the little animals in the air had been a good one, but the more weight Xylex gained, the more she sank towards the earth. In fact, since among the hovering bodies, hers was the largest, mollusks and seaweeds and plankton began to gravitate about her, and soon the child was covered with siliceous little shells, chitinous carapaces, and the fibers of the sea plants. And the further she vanished into that tangle, the more she was freed of the moon's influence, until she gazed at the surface of the water and sank into the sea. We rowed quickly to pull her out and save her. Her body had remained magnetized, and we had to work hard to scrape up all the things encrusted on her. Tender corals were wound about her head, and every time we ran the comb through her hair, there was a shower of crayfish and sardines. Her eyes were sealed shut by limpets clinging to the lids with their suckers. Squid's tentacles were coiled around her arms and her neck, and her little dress now seemed woven only of weeds and sponges. We got the worst of it off her, but for weeks afterwards she went on pulling out fins and shells, and her skin dotted with little diatoms remained affected forever, looking to someone who didn't observe her carefully as if it were faintly dusted with freckles. This should give you an idea of how the influences of Earth and Moon were practically equal, fought over the space between them. I'll tell you something else. A body that descended to the Earth from the satellite was still charged for a while with lunar force and rejected the attraction of our world. Even I, big and heavy as I was, every time I'd been up there, I took a while to get used to the Earth's up and down, and the others would have to grab my arms and hold me, clinging in a bunch to a swaying boat, while I still had my head hanging and my legs stretching up towards the sky. Hold on to us," they shouted at me, and in all that groping sometimes I ended up seizing one of Mrs. Vlad's breasts, which were round and firm, and the contact was good and secure, and had an attraction as strong as the moon's, or even stronger, especially if I managed, as I plunged down, to put my other arm around her hips, and with this I passed back into our world and fell with a thud into the bottom of the boat, where Captain Vlad brought me around, throwing a bucket of water in my face. This is how the story of my love for the captain's wife began, and my suffering. Because it didn't take me long to realize whom the lady kept looking at insistently when my cousin's hands clasped the satellite. I watched Mrs. Vidvid, and in her eyes I could read the thoughts that the deaf man's familiarity with the moon were amusing in her. And when he disappeared in his mysterious lunar explorations, I saw her become restless, as if on pins and needles, and then it was all clear to me how Mrs. Vlivlid was becoming jealous of the moon, and I was jealous of my cousin.